Sawing and piercing is one of my favorite jewelry making techniques. I like to think of it as drawing in metal. It's a great way to work with imagery. You will need a V-board, a jeweler's handsaw, some way to make a hole, some files, and a bit of emery. A what board? A V-board is where all the action happens. Where can I get a V-board? V-boards can be purchased at your local jewelry supply shop or online. But I prefer to make my own out of a bit of 1x4 hardwood. Mine is cherry, but really it could be any wood. Pine, spruce, MDF, as long as it's smooth. A V-board can be secured to your workspace with bolts or a clamp. Let's say I want to cut this out. Normally, I would use a piece of copper about this big. But I'm going to use a larger piece of copper than I need so my fingers aren't in the way of your view. How did you get the image on the copper? Good question. Draw or print your image onto label paper. Alternatively, you could glue your image onto the copper. A center punch is a little divot which gives the drill bit something to snug into. Otherwise, it may skitter around the metal, making a mess. Use a steel block, center punch, and a hammer. Any hammer will do. Remember, you're not trying to go through the metal with the center punch. That's what drill bits are for. You should not see any big bumps on the back side. You just need to hit hard enough to create a divot which the drill bit can snug into, without putting any bumps on the back side. And drill a hole. I know I always say to drill into a bit of scrap wood, but you can also drill over the V opening. You just don't want to make holes all over your V-board. To learn more about drilling holes, please view. Sometimes drilling will cause a burr on the backside. Remove the burr with a bit of 220 emery. Burrs are rough and like to snag on the V-board, which can make it difficult to cut a smooth line. The jeweler's handsaw is one of the most important tools in your kit, so it's important to learn not only how to use it, but how to maintain and care for it. The jeweler's handsaw consists of the handle, the throat, and 3 nuts. Depending on the depth of throat, the jeweler's handsaw will cost between $10 and $20 US, and can be purchased at your local jewelry supply shop or online. Which size do you recommend? A 3.5-inch saw frame is my preferred depth of throat. I find it gets most jobs done quite nicely. A brand new handsaw will come collapsed and covered in grease. Wipe the grease off with a dry cloth. Do not wash it, it will rust. First, open up the saw. How much? It really doesn't matter. We'll be adjusting it to the correct size in a bit. But for now, this much will do. Rest the top of the saw frame against your bench, and rest the handle against your body. This way you'll have both hands free. Insert the saw blade into the top nut first, all the way until you hit the stopper. The saw blade only has teeth on one side. If this is the top and this is the bottom, the teeth of the saw blade should be facing out and pointing down towards the bottom or the handle. Carefully run your finger up the blade. You should feel the prick of the saw blade teeth going up and no prick of the saw blade teeth going down. Always feel your prick up. Next, adjust the height of your saw frame. I like to have it about so. Unlike the top nut, you do not want the saw blade all the way into the bottom nut. This will make sense in a bit. Before securing the bottom, check to make sure the blade is parallel to the saw frame. If not, adjust it. Push the saw frame against the table. This will cause the saw frame to bend in and the saw blade to move deeper into the bottom nut. Hold the saw frame in this position and tighten the bottom nut. This will set the saw blade tension. Without tension on the saw blade, the blade will wiggle about, and you will not be able to control the cut. Also, you'll break a lot of saw blades. Give your blade a ping. Lovely sound. If you find you're having problems controlling the cut, check your saw blade tension. If the tension is good, you could have a bent saw blade. Even a brand new, just out of the package saw blade could be bent. It really doesn't take much to bend a saw blade. A little wax on the back side of the saw blade helps lubricate the blade and make for a smoother cut. What kind of wax? I prefer beeswax or sculpting wax with beeswax in it, as it's sticky and stays on the blade longer. But any wax will do, even the butt end of an old votive candle. Why on the back side of the blade? You could apply wax to the front of the saw blade, but be mindful that more is not better. It's really easy to clog up the teeth with wax. Then you have no teeth. I put wax on the back side of the blade as I find it less likely to clog up the teeth. There really isn't much to handsaw maintenance. You just need to keep your nuts clean. Every once in a while, remove your nuts. Broken saw blade bits, metal dust, and wax can accumulate under your nuts. Every once in a while, give them a wipe with your fingers, or a dry cloth if you prefer. If you find the saw blade keeps slipping out of your nuts, give them a clean. Saw blades come in different sizes. They will all come in the same length, but will be different in how many or how large the teeth are. I like to think of it as a scale. The further you go this way, the coarser or bigger the teeth are, and the further you go this way, the finer or the smaller the teeth are. On this side of the scale, you have whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, 8 being the coarsest. And on this side of the scale, you have aught sizes, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80, 80 being the finest. It's a rare occasion when I use a whole number saw blade, as I find them too coarse. They tend to bind in the metal and remove too much material. What size saw blade should I use? I recommend beginners start with a 3/0. You can purchase your saw blades from your local jewelry supply store or online. By the single dozen or by the gross, which is a dozen. 144 blades? That's a lot of blades. Do I need that many blades? No. To start, a dozen should do you just fine. Although everyone is different, you may break a few blades or a lot of blades. Experience will let you know how many you need. But with practice, you'll break fewer and fewer blades. Always dispose of sharps safely in a plastic container with a screw-top lid. I use an old ammonia bottle. It's where all my broken saw blades, used scalpels, bent or broken drill bits end up. And don't forget to label it. I usually cut out the interior bits first, while I have something big to hold on to, then the exterior bits. Thread the saw blade through the hole, push the metal all the way up the saw frame, and tilt the handle up. Otherwise, the weight of the metal will make it difficult to get a tight blade. Straddle the metal with your fingers. This will make it easier to hold the metal against the V-board and to move it around. Let the saw do the job. It's the sharpness of the blade, not your force, which cuts through the metal. I often cut directly on the cut line, but I would recommend beginners to cut slightly inside the line. Always give yourself a little bit of mucking up room. As long as you're on the correct side of your cut line, files and emery can be used to crisp up your sawing. Go slowly. This is not a race. Your goal is accuracy, not speed. Be sure to hold the saw frame straight up and down, not at an angle. It's quite possible to cut the top and bottom of the metal differently, so be mindful of this. Brush away any metal dust with a paintbrush. If you can't see the line, you can't follow the line. As I come into my point, I'll need to do a pivot. Pivot? Apply a bit of wax to the back side of the blade. Move the blade up and down. Although my saw is moving up and down, because I'm not applying any forward pressure to the saw frame, the saw is not cutting forward. Slowly turn the metal. Once in the cut, pull the blade towards yourself. As there are no teeth on the back side of the saw blade, it can be used to pivot on. If you turn the metal too fast, the blade will break. As my teacher used to say, if you're not breaking blades, you're not working. But with practice, you'll break fewer and fewer blades. At my second point, rather than pivoting, I'm going to take the points out in chunks. Why? A pivot is in essence using your saw blade like a drill bit, so it will leave a small round hole. But for this point, I want a tight corner. Saw down to the end of the point. Then carefully back the saw blade out just a bit. Cut across. And pivot onto the cut line. As you come to the end of the cut, slide over and cut into the wood. This will stabilize your blade, slow down the cut, and help prevent cross-cutting. To restart your cut, push your blade firmly against the existing cut line. This will help stabilize your blade. Slowly bring the blade down and continue cutting. As I finish cutting out my heart, just for a split second, nothing will be holding my blade, causing me to punch forward. Now I've nicked my heart. I could have avoided this by sliding over and cutting into the V-board. Something to keep in mind for next time. Chances are you're going to have to do some filing and/or emmering. Depending on how good or not so good your sawing is, you may need to spend a small amount of time or a not so small amount of time cleaning up the cut. This is where you'll notice the benefit of sawing slowly and accurately. Generally, files are coarse and emeries are fine. So use files if you have a fair amount of metal to remove and emeries when you have a small amount of metal to remove, or to smooth and remove file marks. When it comes to choosing the right file, basically use a file which best matches the shape you are filing. This part of my heart is curved, so I'm going to use a half-round file. A half-round file has one side which is curved and one which is flat. The curved side of my file will help shape out the curve in my heart and get rid of my nick, whereas the flat side will work nicely for the straighter sections. It can be helpful to flip and file. This way you can see the full shape as it is without the paper design as a distraction. Always be mindful of how you're holding the file. Straight up and down, not tilted. You don't want to bevel your edges, unless of course you do want to bevel your edges. I don't, so I'm being mindful to hold the file straight up and down. Files will leave file marks. We don't like file marks. We don't? No, we don't. Emery will remove file marks. We like emery. Start with 220 grit. You can use loose emery strips or emery strips with a handsaw. Apply a bit of tape to the back side of a bit of emery, trim, and cut. And there you have it, a lovely emery strip. Emery strips can also be used with a hand saw. The process of attaching an emery strip to the saw frame is the same as a saw blade. My strip is 14 centimeters long and 1 centimeter wide. Insert the emery strip until it touches the screw threads of the top nut of the saw frame. Tighten the nut and be sure the strip is parallel to the back side of the saw frame. If not, fuss with it until it is. Adjust the length of the saw frame until the emery strip just touches the top of the bottom nut. Insert the emery strip and give the saw frame a push against the table. The strip should be nice and tight. Sawing out the outside is pretty much the same as sawing out the inside, but no hole required. A tight curve is very much like a pivot point. You need to control the forward movement. With a pivot, you don't want the saw blade moving forward at all. But with a tight curve, you want the saw blade to move forward very slowly. So just a tiny bit of forward pressure on the saw frame. If you apply too much forward pressure, you'll have a hard time making the curve tight. Most beginners apply too much force to the saw frame. The saw blade can only remove so much material at a time. So trying to force the blade through the metal is not really going to work. It's the sharpness of the saw blade which cuts through the metal, not your force against the saw frame. Putting too much forward pressure on the saw frame will result in a poor cut and broken saw blades. Breathe deeply, relax. Always let the saw blade do the work. This is not a race. Remember, you're after accuracy, not speed. Once you have developed some mad sawing skills, speed will come all on its own. There are also several exterior pivot points, which are pretty much the same as interior pivot points. Always apply a bit of wax to the backside of the blade before starting a pivot. Turn the metal slowly, and remember, no forward pressure on the saw frame. You want to keep it stationary. There are also a couple partial pivot points, so no forward pressure, and turn the metal slowly. As long as you're on the correct side of the cut line, a bit of filing and emerying can clean up any bad cut. My favorite half-round file will fit nicely in these curves, whereas the other side, the flat side, can do the rest. Don't forget to keep an eye on the tilties. But since I was slow and accurate with my sawing, not to mention I've been doing this for 25 years, quite honestly, I don't need to do any filing and can go straight to 220 emery. As it happens, my file handle is just the right size that if I wrap a bit of 220 emery around it and secure it with a bit of tape, I'd have a most excellent emery tool. A bit of emery on a bit of dowel, secured with a bit of tape, will smooth out this curve. And the ever-handy emery pad will make short work of this straight bit. Don't forget the points. We don't like sharp, pointy jewelry. Now that you know how to saw and pierce, it's time to saw out some flowers.